All right, I think we're live.
I think so. Is this working?
Working for me.
Oh man, okay, we've done it.
We did it. I think we should just wait a few minutes for folks to like jump on.
Yeah.
I've never done this before, so this is brand new for me.
Super exciting. Go technology win for us.
Like, I had a last minute like tech problem where my was on like the wrong browser, and I was like, oh no. But we did it.
But yeah, great. This is a great service, being able to stream like this.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll wait a few minutes. Should we start in like a minute or two then?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. Cool. Well, how are things in the life of a global pandemic for you, Jordan?
I mean, they're pretty good, I guess, all things considered. How things been on your end?
It's been all right. Yeah, it's certainly I'm sure you experienced this with a weird shift from being like, I talk to people all the time. Mm-hmm. That's what you do when you're a candidate. And then go from that to like not seeing anyone except your immediate family. So yeah, so it's certainly been like a crazy transition. But yeah, no, it's been a minute, but it's a lot to talk about with all the things happening. Oh, yeah. So yeah. Oh boy. But yeah. Then yeah, so it's pretty cool to have both our like videos at once.
Yeah, I'm really excited because like StreamYard, I've never used it before or like done stuff live, so it's brand new. So I'm really happy that we get to do this like and just share.
Yeah, that was super stoked. Hope this will be the beginning of many series.
Yeah, a little fireside chat while the world's on fire.
Right. But yeah. All right, so I'm wondering maybe we'll give another minute and then we'll get started.
Like seeing a lot of folks jumping in right now.
Oh yeah. Just trying to see if I can see it on my Facebook as well. I think let's see.
I'm seeing like a lot of candidates and like electeds doing a lot of these, which has been really helpful because I guess first-time candidates, like campaigning in the time of coronavirus was super not on my wish list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's particularly tough, especially when you're running a grassroots campaign, because it just relies on relational organizing, and that's just so much harder.
And I am someone who absolutely loves canvassing, so
yeah,
it's a little tough for me.
Same. Canvassing is so fun, and we can't do it. It's sad.
Only for now.
Only for now, but yeah.
This too shall pass.
Yeah.
I think we're probably good to start.
We've got a critical mass here, so very cool. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We're really excited to launch this live stream to talk about COVID-19 and housing. And so we'll just to give a quick overview of what we'll talk about. We're going to just talk a little bit about the problem, right, and how COVID's affecting us, and particularly our districts. And then we'll go into some of the solutions that are out there right now and some of the resources as well that are out there. And then kind of draw on like how that should inform policy moving forward, right, after the COVID crisis around housing. And we'll wrap it up all with questions at the end, as well as just some plugs for how you can get involved in organizing around housing in Massachusetts. So just to start us off, we'll just quickly introduce ourselves and our candidacy. So hi everyone, my name is Erica Eiderhoven. I'm running for the 27th Middlesex State Representative District. My district is mostly the heart of Somerville, so very excited. And I'm running because I truly believe that all of our voices belong in the State House, and that has informed a lot of my work. I'm the co-founder of Act on Mass. We're one of the lead organizations fighting for our voice in the State House. And unfortunately, currently the State House is, if you are not white, wealthy, or well-connected, your voice doesn't really get heard there, and that needs to change. And I think particularly around drawing external pressure into the building and having our, I believe our electorate is incredibly progressive. Our generation is incredibly progressive, and our voice needs to be heard. So I'm running on fighting for a Massachusetts Green New Deal, housing justice. I believe housing is a human right and should be available for all. Funding our public schools and immigration reform. We have a large immigrant community in Somerville, and their voices are not being heard even since the wake of the 2016 election. Our state just hasn't done enough, and so I'm running to fight for those progressive causes, as well as ensure that grassroots voices are continued, as well as union voices are continued in the state house. So that's my little intro. I'm going to hand it over to Jordan.
Yeah, so for folks who don't know me, I'm Jordan Meehan. I am running for state rep out here in Allston-Brighton in the 17th Suffolk, which covers about half of Allston-Brighton. I'm running on a platform similar to Erica's to build a Massachusetts for the many. The things that really draw me into this fight are housing justice, transit equity, and a Green New Deal for Massachusetts, all of which are very deeply interconnected. I think you and I can both agree that we haven't seen much in the way of meaningful action in the State House on any of those three issues and then some. So yeah, that's what really brings me into this fight. So I'm really excited to be doing this with Erica specifically because there are so many similarities between our two districts in terms of demographics, in terms of the issues that folks in our districts care about, the things that are impacting us the most. I think like first and foremost, we have a lot of renters in our districts, respectively. I know Allston-Brighton and my district is about 85% renter to homeowner, which is pretty overwhelmingly compared to other spots, and very young. I think the median age in our district is about 26 to 27, around that area. So you see a lot of, young professionals, grad students, and the like. So I think that's pretty similar over in Somerville, right?
Yeah, we have a little bit lower percentage, but very similar. We have 65% renter to homeowner, but similarly very young. Our median age is really low 30s. I think I'm actually like the median age of Somerville, like as a candidate. Some people say, "Oh, you're really young," and I'm like, "Well, I am the median age."
I'm representative.
Yeah, I'm quite representative. But yeah, no. And I think another piece just to build on that is both of our communities have been absolutely ravaged by the gentrification crisis, right? I mean, I think I'm not quite sure the statistics on Allston-Brighton, particularly because it's Boston, but the increase in prices for housing has been the highest in Somerville as a municipality, and I'm sure Allston-Brighton, if you separate it from the rest of Boston, it's also just been massively increasing over the past 10 years. And I think another thing to add too is that we both have incredibly progressive districts, right? If you look at previous voting records, we elected Ayanna Presley in Somerville, it's the bluest districts in the country as well as the state. And so along with that, it makes sense that the representatives are pushing for bold progressive change. And so that is something that, encompasses and represents my campaign, is that we need to have these bold solutions in a time when, we've seen the American worker be completely carved out over the past few decades. Housing prices going up, healthcare costs, education are all turning into things that are unattainable. That's where I think our districts needs that kind of leadership that is going to push for bold change.
Yeah, I remember just because you mentioned Ayanna, since I was a super volunteer in that campaign, I remember she was talking in a backyard in Somerville, actually, at a campus launch about how this is the bluest district federally in the country. This is where we need to be pushing for the boldest change possible, because this is the safest place and the most right place to be doing so. Especially that's very true of both of our districts in the state. And just on the affordability crisis in the neighborhood, we do have some data from the CDC, from the Allston-Brighton CDC, that the average cost of a 1-bedroom has jumped 30% in the past 2 years. A 4-bedroom apartment has jumped 50% in the past 2 years. And just the jump for the past decade has been staggering.
Yeah, it's absolutely atrocious.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's represents a bit of how COVID-19 in particular is impacting our districts because of the populations and the people who live in our districts. And so, particularly the impact we have seen on particularly temporary workers, right, or young people who are sort of between jobs or doing sort of temporary work, have been, are in these high risk industries. I know, Jordan, you looked into some of the things around the statistics on that in Massachusetts as well. You want to share a little bit?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a data numbers geek. So I got some of these numbers from a friend of mine. There's about 1 million workers statewide who are in these high risk industries as the COVID crisis unfolds. And just to break that down a little bit more, that encompasses about 260,000 full and part-time retail workers and about 240,000 full and part-time food and hospitality service workers. And we've been seeing, not only anecdotally, but in terms of numbers, those are the other sectors that are being laid off the highest, that are being impacted the most. And we've seen federally today, in the past week, there were, I think, 6.6 million more unemployment claims on top of last week's 3.5 million. Yeah, we're seeing just those sectors in particular are being hit so hard, and they are definitely in Alston, Brighton, and in Somerville disproportionately represented among the population.
Yeah, and even just statewide, I mean, it's like 1 million workers. That's 1/7 of our state population. So this is a widespread statewide issue that requires such like clear leadership, right, in our state government to be passing. We'll go into a little bit about that too, about like what kind of policies we should be seeing based on like how how widespread this problem is. And
just get real nerdy real fast.
So. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's our style. So what can we do? But yeah, no, and I think it's worth noting too, it's April 2nd. So yesterday rent was due for a huge chunk of our districts, and we haven't seen any tangible relief that has come into people's pockets yet, right? I mean, there's a lot of good ideas out there, but the fact that even like our governments are moving so slowly to get the relief in our hands, I mean, I think the timeliness and the speed at which we get help is really, incredibly crucial. And so I think, in terms of just like jumping into the policy side, maybe Jordan, why don't you kick us off in terms of like, I think we both believe in having housing be a human right. So, maybe you can share a little bit on the piece around the housing protections.
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest thing around the biggest questions I've been seeing and getting are around what are our rights right now in this crisis as tenants. So I think just we'll link to some more things in either in the chat or below. But the biggest highlight is if you have a housing court date, all housing court dates have been postponed, at least I think until the beginning of May is the most recent update I've seen. CHAPA.org has a list of tenant rights in the crisis, ranging from what to do if you have a court date, if you have pending eviction stuff against you, if you have any kind of pending housing court case. Those have been pushed back. Let's see. Something I want to shout out specifically around homeless shelters and emergency assistance. A lot of office closures are impacting how you can reach out to like the Department of Housing and Community Development, but they have a number that we can drop in a comment around emergency assistance. It's 866-584-0653. And you can find more details around shelter assistance for families with children at the Massachusetts Coalition for the Homeless website. They're a fantastic group that I work with pretty closely in my day job. Going off of that, there's also resources from DHCD around emergency shelter for individuals, and they have a list of individual shelters that are maintained by the state. Another big highlight is legislation from Mike Connolly, a representative from Cambridge and one of my personal heroes. That bill he's introduced would place a moratorium statewide on evictions. So right now, even though Housing Court has postponed all of these court dates, there's no legislation that requires them to do so. So it's mostly just they're doing it out of administrative need as opposed to a legislative mandate. So this bill would put a moratorium on evictions until the COVID crisis passes. So that was introduced 2.5 weeks ago. It's still in committee and has not got a committee vote or a full House vote. And they're working out the differences between this one and a version introduced by the Senate. But something important to know in the Senate version is that there are a lot of gaps in this safety net. So specifically, the Senate version of this moratorium bill would put a moratorium on evictions, but would allow things like no-fault evictions to maintain. And a no-fault eviction essentially means that your landlord can evict you for no reason against you. It's a huge loophole. It's extremely discriminatory. I know some folks who are being evicted right now because they're gay. And so their landlord is using like a no-fault eviction to get around anti-discrimination statutes, which is extremely troubling.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a pretty big difference between the House version of the bill and the Senate version of the bill. We're also going to drop in the chat a community resource guide that my campaign has put out last week. I think we just dropped it in there, full of resources that span from healthcare, housing, legal stuff. And there's another set of legislation around rent specifically that you want to talk about that, Erica?
Yeah, for sure. So we actually just saw yesterday. Also, Mike Connolly has put out a rent freeze. It's a draft legislation. It has not been filed yet, as far as I'm aware. But it is to freeze payments on rent, right? So related to evictions. I mean, that's sort of the most dire situation. The rent, people being in a precarious situation due to rent is the next step. And so I think that's a really exciting piece of legislation that will hopefully be filed very soon, because they go hand in hand, right? Without one, you don't really quite have the other. And I think another bill that I want to highlight as well that has been filed early on during when the COVID crisis hit was the bill by Lindsay Sabadosa and Paul Mark, HD 4956, is pushing for a freeze on rent increases. So essentially, it is just like a across the board rent control, right, during this crisis, which makes a lot of sense given that we can't have people being precarious situations with their housing, particularly now when that is our public health relies on everyone being able to self-isolate. And so one thing that I love about this bill that I want to highlight is that there are no if, buts, and ands in this. It's literally just across the board. So it's incredibly simple. And again, if it's passed into law, there's no like kind of exceptions in case. And I just want to point that out because a lot of the laws, or like the bills, sorry, I should say, that have been released so far have some kind of if provision, like if you are financially affected by, or in detriment of the COVID crisis, which really opens this giant can of worms, or in particularly an administrative can of worms, where how does one prove that you are financially, affected or financially in a bad situation? And that kind of comes back to how pervasive this financial instability is, both in our districts, but also statewide, that it's hitting so many people. And to have provisions in there of like, if you are affected enough, right, then you are, not liable to pay your rent during the COVID crisis. One, adds a lot of confusion. One of the issues that will come up, we'll keep talking about in housing is that it's a really complicated issue. And so people don't really know their rights. And so having complicated legislation where you're sort of like unclear, you're in the gray zone. Do I count? Do I qualify? Who do I have to fight to, prove that I was affected enough? Which administrative body do I have to go through? Do I have to go through a court, right? All those like questions that arise, particularly in this time of crisis, can be incredibly harmful, because even if we pass something into law, it might actually not make it in terms of what, affects people's daily lives. So that's why I'm a huge fan of this bill. There isn't any of these sort of means testing, oh, well, what if, and like, it kind of comes back to like I'll throw an example, like software engineers who are still able to work and they're still, living their stable lives. That is a pretty small percentage of the population that is okay. And when the most of the population, we're going to see such high unemployment rates, it's safe to assume that most people are going through financial hardship, and those are not the people who need to be going through additional administrative hurdles. And that's why I'm such a big fan of like, well, not just fan, like I will be filing bills that do not have these if, buts, and ands in them, right? But actually just clearly says, okay, no evictions. All right, no like utility shutoffs. It just needs to be that clear and easy to understand. Otherwise, we're going to face, a lot of consequences, and particularly in this time of crisis, it needs to happen quickly, right? Because people aren't going to be able to make ends meet. So
yeah, and I just want to jump on that point. As a lawyer, I would recognize that there's a lot of difficulty in navigating all of these means testing hurdles and hoops to jump through that I would have to navigate if I was going through it. So to make someone who's maybe lost their job and is caring for kids and is fighting with their landlord or trying to get unemployment, to make the most vulnerable people who are getting impacted the most go through all those additional hurdles is immoral.
Yeah.
Straight up, that is immoral. Wrong.
Yeah. And it's just crazy too, because when you just compare that with the bill that was just passed, the stimulus bill, it's a classic example of socialism for the rich and brutal capitalism for the poor, right? When you say that corporations get this huge bailout with no strings attached, right? Very little conditions, oversight. And then when you have the most vulnerable people in our society having to go through all these legal administrative hoops to prove that they are deserving of just basic, holding on to their housing and livelihood. That's just a gross example of how, we just kind of give complete leeway to some of the most powerful entities in
Mhm.
our country, and then yet like heavily litigate and check and control like people who actually really need these
Mhm.
resources. And it really should be as simple, a great example of like not means testing, right, is a library. Just go to library.
Right.
Do they ever check if you can afford a book?
Mhm.
No, like
No.
everyone just gets the book. And it should be as simple as that, right? That's the model that I think you and I are both
Exactly.
aspiring towards. So
Yeah,
yeah.
one more bill I want to shout out before we talk about things to focus on in the next session is a bill from Nika Eligardo and Lindsay Sabadosa around decarceration.
Yes.
So this bill, it's not housing specific, but when we think about this crisis and the most vulnerable people affected, folks who are incarcerated they have nowhere to go, and they have very limited access, if any at all, to healthcare.
Yeah.
So this bill, an act regarding decarceration and COVID-19, would require the release of individuals who are in pretrial detainment, who are under incarceration, and if they are a member of a population who the CDC determines are like very vulnerable, or if they're eligible for medical parole, or almost finished with their sentence, or only being detained due to their inability to pay cash bail, or minor violations of parole. So folks who don't really pose a risk to public safety at all, this bill would help release them to decarcerate and just lower the risk of infections in prisons. So I think that's really important and hasn't really gotten lifted up in discussion around all of these response bills. But
Yeah. It
um,
really comes back to like the fact that particularly in this health crisis, we are only as strong as the most vulnerable or most unhealthy individuals, right? And
exactly.
if we subject particularly our, prison people who are in prison right now to unsanitary, unsafe conditions, I mean, that is
Mhm.
just going to exacerbate the crisis further. And now more than ever, I mean, there was a moral obligation before the crisis.
Mhm.
But now it's like, it's actually like the rubber has hit the road in terms
Mhm.
of saying we need to move on this and we have to decarcerate, and particularly people with nonviolent
Mhm.
crimes, and like people who are elderly, high risk, who are
Mhm.
stuck in an incarcerated state. I mean, it's just absolutely necessary, and that kind of leads into also the issue around homelessness.
Mhm.
Because if you've ever been to any shelter, and I actually worked on the 2010 census, so I actually went to like all the shelters in the Boston area to count individuals, and it's just like that. It's not you cannot do social distancing in
Right.
any shelter. There's just no question. So it's
No.
either you have to be crammed into a shelter or you're out on the streets, right? And so it
Mhm.
just really comes back to this need of anyone having access to housing is such a fundamental human right,
Human rights.
right? And that's
Mhm.
where these housing first models are really, really important, and we need to see more action on that, particularly in the midst of this crisis. That's the
Mhm.
sort of bold action we need. I know there's like organizing happening across the country around saying, look, we've got all these
Mhm.
unoccupied residencies where they just like built a luxury condo, and now of course you can just
Couldn't
leave it
fill it.
empty.
Shocking.
Yeah, couldn't fill it. Yeah, yeah, $4,000 for a one bedroom. I can't believe you couldn't find anyone to pay that. But like it should be unlawful that we have these unoccupied spaces when there's so many people who are out there on the streets or out in prisons, and should
Mhm.
not be there, especially in the midst of this crisis. If we want to see some bold action around curbing the increased spread of
Mhm.
this virus, that is the what we need to see right now.
Yeah,
So
and Massachusetts alone, I think in 2018 saw, I believe it was a 14% increase in homelessness,
mhm.
which was the largest in
Yeah,
the nation.
yeah.
So I think there's like 1,000 permanently unhoused folks in the state, and then around 20,000 folks bounce between shelters or housing and
Hmm.
unstable. So it's a growing crisis, and I think something that's really focused on about COVID-19 is it has really laid bare these structural deficiencies in our social safety net that
Yeah.
existed already, but have just been blown up ever since
Hmm.
it really hit. So I think I just really want to finish up our main chat by talking about the things that we would want to focus on once we're elected next year
Yeah.
in the state house. Um, and I think I'm so happy to be doing this discussion with you because we have very similar platforms around
Hmm.
housing. So
Hmm.
we dropped our housing platform in January, and we can drop that into the chat as well. That calls for a number of things. First and foremost would be to lift the ban on rent control, which is
Hmm.
currently pending in the State House now. I'm not sure where that's going to go, considering. But the bill introduced by Mike Connolly and Nika Eligardo would lift the statewide ban on rent control and allow for local options around rent control for municipalities, which is how things were before '94.
Yeah.
I think it's a great necessary, though I would say insufficient step. I think we should be moving towards statewide rent control, similar to California and Oregon,
Mhm.
which just really puts a cap on what rent increases can be. I think California does a 7% cap,
Mhm.
and Oregon, I think, does 5 or one of the two. Um, Another thing that I've been working on has been a comprehensive 10-point tenants bill of rights just to increase tenant protections statewide. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds on that and take up everyone's time. But I think as we think about a tenants bill of rights, something that we've been advocating for is a right to housing, to be quality and
Yeah.
accessible, to pass just cause eviction and get rid of those discriminatory no-fault eviction rules, establishing a right to counsel for folks who are low income and need legal representation when you're in a housing court issue.
Mhm.
I think nationwide, about 90% of landlords have a lawyer in eviction lawsuits, and only about 10% of tenants do, which
Yeah.
is a massive power imbalance. Something else to focus on: eviction ceiling. Because if you have an eviction case against you, that goes onto masscourts.gov or I think .gov, and that's public data. No
Yeah.
matter what the cause, the outcome, your defenses, anything, it's public data. It's up there forever, and it stays on your record for many, many years. So it's just thinking how to fill the gaps in the social safety net around tenants' rights.
Mhm.
And something you've been really focusing on is housing first. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, no, the housing first model, it's interesting because I believe it's the moral right thing to do to ensure that
Mhm.
everyone has access to housing. And it's interesting because housing is so interconnected to
Mhm.
all issues in the sense that when someone is in a situation with unstable housing, it has this massive ripple effect, right, on
Mhm.
everything else in their lives. It lowers their chances of being able to obtain a job, obtain education, obtain just healthcare, basic
Mhm.
healthcare. I mean, there's just so many things that throw people's lives into a loop. And it's actually, there's a moral obligation as our society to do it, but
Mhm.
there's also an economic argument as well, which is that areas that have done, city municipalities and actually Utah
Mhm.
housing first model, they found that it actually saved them money, right? It
Mhm.
saved the state money because you have that ripple effect across all these
Mhm.
different issues that the state is also providing support for. So there's actually like a bizarrely, fiscal conservative
Right.
argument to say we should have a housing first model. And I think another piece of it that's so interesting about that is that it also relates to the to a Green New Deal,
Mhm.
particularly around affordable housing. We need to be investing in building that kind of housing that is net zero carbon emissions.
Mhm.
And so investing in building that kind of housing so that people are not on the streets, but also, properly housed. That's a really
Mhm.
critical issue, and that we need to see that kind of legislation be pushed at the state level. And I'll just add, like, real quickly too, just to the other points around rent control and tenant
Mhm.
protections. I know since both of us have that on our platform, like I, had many conversations with voters
Mhm.
on it. Go like, I heard there was a lot of chaos and drama about in the 90s. So I've had that sort of like emotional reaction from
Mhm.
voters being like, I don't know, I just kind of had that knee-jerk reaction, like it's
Yep.
not a good thing. And I just want to like clarify for our viewers and everyone here with us today that all it means is that there is no justifiable reason to double someone's rent from month to
Mhm.
month, right? And that actually happens to people in our communities all the time. And I've, been, in close contact with Somerville Community Corporation, CAS. These are the organizations that work with families that end up being displaced due
Mhm.
to this problem. And there's just no real reason. And that's why all rent control says is that you can only increase housing prices to some amount that's marginally close to the inflation rate.
Mhm.
That's it, right? There's nothing really big and scary about that. And I found that when I like spell that out or have that
Mhm.
those discussions with voters, it's really like a no-brainer, right? Like who
Yeah.
can justify like increasing someone's rent by $1,000 a month? I mean, that's just an enormous instability in people's
Yeah.
lives. And then when you add to the fact that the cost of moving in Massachusetts and particularly in Boston is so egregiously high because not only do
Mhm.
you have to pay your realtor fee, you got to pay 1 month deposit, first and last month rent. And we're talking thousands of dollars
Yeah.
at
I
a
mean, 4
minimum
months
just
of
for like.
rent just to get a set of keys and a roof over your head, that's outrageous.
Exactly. And like, so and most people don't have that kind of reserve. So when you massively increase someone's rent and they have to move, I
Mhm.
mean, that just brings this incredible amount of instability, which again has those ripple effects. And
Mhm.
so I think it's just so important to see both the rent control part and the tenants protection.
Yeah.
And I think one thing too, I read your platform, which is an amazing resource, so everyone should check it out.
Thank
But I think
you.
one piece that I love too around the tenant bill of rights is that it's mandated to be printed on every lease, right?
Yeah.
Because again, it's like there's this huge issue where we can write the most wonderful, beautiful legislation out there. If people don't, if it's not accessible to people, right, they're not going to know what their rights are. And so having a requirement to say, these are your rights, and to not live in that uncertainty is so important. I mean, just even on my own personal experience, like I've been in a situation where we're renting, and our landlord kind of like, had that like passive, like, hey, I'm not raising, don't make me raise rent next year, right? Like that sort of like, you're living below market, so, behave kind of thing. And we were terrified to report that we had mold all over our, in like many parts of our unit. And we were like, we don't want to bother him, because what if he massively increases the rent on us, and then we'll have to move. And so I think that those, like having that clarity and kind of leveling that playing field between tenants and landlords is so critical. And it's really like kind of underlying all of our policies. So yeah.
And something else I think we need to be focusing on longer term is developing a plan for social housing in Massachusetts. So social housing, for folks who don't know the terms so in depth, would basically just create a public option in the housing market, decommodify housing, and ensure that it is truly treated as a human right and not just a market commodity. So we know like public housing in the United States, and how it really hasn't worked out to ensure that folks have safe, affordable, and accessible housing. It's created a lot of concentrations of poverty. It's been defunded and neglected. The Faircloth Amendment federally prevents us from building any new federal public housing, which is breathtaking. So social housing, as we would imagine it, I take a lot of inspiration from the Vienna model, which creates mixed income social housing for anyone who wants it, instead of having like an income a requirement or restriction. So I think by doing that, you have a lot of that socioeconomic blending that really helps everyone, breaks down a lot of barriers interpersonally and socioeconomically, and just ensures that if you need a safe and accessible, permanently affordable place to live, there will be one available to you. And that, I think, is going to be the longer term project we really need to be focusing on once we're in the State House.
Yeah, totally. No, it's such a critical issue. And again, it's a long-term solution, but we need to see that kind of investment in our affordable housing stock, right? I mean, it's like, again, related to climate crisis, like housing and transportation are the two places we absolutely need to see some massive government investment. And again, we can't leave it just up to the private markets to say, okay, yeah, we'll just increase supply through whatever developers want to make. And it's like, well,
luxury housing.
This is luxury housing, which is, it completely changes the dynamics of a district. And it's something, I think, just to come back to our district's needs, we've seen through the gentrification crisis in both our districts that there's this massive amount of displacement. I like every time I went on the, knocking on doors, shift was that, I don't know anybody on my street anymore. I used to know everybody growing up here, and now they're all gone. They all got priced out. And that's not the kind of community we want to build. We want to build one that is diverse and has, and connected, right? Exactly. So I think we're reaching to the kind of 30-minute mark now. So I want to maybe open it up to maybe one will just share a little bit about resources on organizing, and then let's open up to questions. How does that sound?
Folks have questions, you want to pop into the chat, go for it. We are here to help.
And George, you can see the questions, is that right?
Yes, I can. Okay. Right, because I'm like controlling the stream. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I was like, I'll take your lead on that. But yeah, no. Real quickly around organizing resources. I think first and foremost, right? Like there have been these amazing mutual aid groups that have popped up all across the country, and there's no exception between Alston, Brighton, and Somerville. And actually, if you go, we'll drop the link below. There is this amazing resource where you can see like every pod, right, or every neighborhood block that has a mutual aid resource. So if you are looking to either volunteer or you need help in terms of grocery deliveries or whatever you need to sustain yourself and to be able to stay safe during this crisis, that's an incredible resource. And then I think a second one too is City Life Urbana has been an amazing advocate for housing, even during this crisis and after. Like, please get involved. They do some amazing work around housing.
They have a great hotline right now. I'll drop that info. If you have a displacement emergency, they have an emergency hotline. So I will pop in there right now in the comments.
Yeah,
They're just a
absolutely.
fantastic group.
They're a fantastic group. I can't say enough the good things about them. So yeah, and then there's also this new group called People's Action,
Mhm.
and so they are actually having a call this afternoon. I believe they're at 4 or 5. That is around organizing homes for all, right?
Mhm.
Ensuring that we all have homes. And so the kind of Massachusetts-based organization in this coalition is Neighbor to Neighbor, another incredible organizing group led by people of color in Massachusetts. So definitely want to elevate that.
Mhm.
Also, I think like in every, just to like plug like local organizing happening in each of our districts. I mean, in Somerville, we actually have the Somerville Teachers Association is pushing for a lot of the demands that we outlined on this call, and that they are currently, taking signatures and petitioning and pushing our city to protect its residents. So I want to give a little plug out to them too, because they've been doing such amazing work, both around negotiating a living wage for paraprofessionals before, and now they're using that same organizing to fight for our right to a stable home. So yeah.
Perfect. We have one big comment, a news update actually, from my friend Pat. The House just passed while the stream was happening an eviction and foreclosure pause. Fantastic. I don't
Whoa.
use Twitter, so I don't know what's happening in the world.
We're like, wow, in the midst of our live
What a
stream.
time to be streaming.
I think we should just do these more often then. That
I'm
kind of
thinking
gets
that
the House to
and the
pass
question
laws.
was, is an eviction and foreclosure pause enough? I think we both agree that a pause is not enough. I think a rent cancellation is probably the most necessary and pressing thing we can do right now. Because if 1 in 7 people in Massachusetts are in these high risk industries, and millions are filing for unemployment nationwide, those numbers are going to be very high here. And if you don't have a job to pay your rent, if you just freeze rent and then have to pay 2 months worth of rent or 3 months down the road once you have your job back, all you have is a mountain of debt waiting for you at the end of the tunnel. So an eviction or a rent pause, an eviction pause especially only delays an eviction. It doesn't cancel one or anything like that. Necessary step, not sufficient to really solve the housing crisis within the COVID-19 crisis or more generally. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that that's absolutely true. That like we need to be continuing this, and that again, like the COVID-19 crisis in general has really highlighted sort of these like issues in our social safety net, and also just like I think the COVID crisis has made it like tangible because again, we're only as safe as the most unhealthy or ill person who lives right in our society. But I think we need to continue that. Like we should be thinking that same framework post COVID. We should not have to have a global pandemic to push ourselves to do that. Everyone should have a right to a dignified life, and so I'm very much in favor of continuing some of these policies. Right? I mean, like the example of the Sabados and Mark bill of freezing rent. I mean, like, maybe not 0%, but like you can certainly do that throughout the legislation. So
yeah, and one other group I want to just plug is this new group, Austin Brighton Mutual Aid, that's popped up in the neighborhood. I will link their Twitter below. They have been just helping out with grocery drop off and pickup, help with home care and pet sitting, the whole range of things you would really need just around this crisis. We have another question. Can a landlord use COVID as a reason to evict a tenant? For example, I'll put it up on the screen. If a tenant continues working in a pharmacy or a grocery store during the crisis and is considered by the landlord at higher risk of exposure, can the tenant be asked to vacate? Sounds crazy. It doesn't sound too crazy. I think this kind of goes back to the just cause eviction issue. So under current law, and if this eviction moratorium goes into effect and gets signed by the governor, any eviction against someone with COVID would be delayed. So I guess that might solve the problem since you wouldn't be symptomatic by the time any eviction case would be going through anyways. But I believe if this moratorium goes into place, then anyone who is being asked to vacate because of COVID-19 exposure would be safe.
Yeah.
But, going back to just the need to get rid of this no-fault eviction. Under current law, if you weren't going through a pandemic, for example, and a landlord said, "Oh, you're sick. I don't want you in my apartment. You need to. I'm evicting you." That would be totally legal.
Yeah,
and that's a massive, massive problem.
Yeah, it's incredibly discriminatory as well. And just like, I mean, this is the question we just received as an example of discriminating by your health, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, it's fairly ableist even, right? Like
Mhm.
you're infected with a virus and unable to work right now. And then
Right.
we're saying,
You're
well,
probably
you're
unable to get it
infectious,
done.
so I want to kick you out. I mean, that's just not the right approach. And it's interesting too, because actually another thing, I mean, we haven't quite seen this in Massachusetts, but there's this sort of need, that because they've imposed like stay at home in some states
Mhm.
or some countries in the world, police are out, beating people up for being where they have to be. And it's kind of similar to like kicking someone out of their homes because they have COVID.
Mhm.
I mean, we need, again, like shelter for everybody. And so, I mean, beating homeless or people who are not housed currently because they're out on the streets is just insane, right? And it's sort of
Mhm.
like that sort of punitive response should absolutely be blocked by such laws. So
Yeah. And one more thing I want to just pop into the chat. Lawyers for Civil Rights is offering legal help around COVID-19 issues ranging from housing to immigration to healthcare access, the whole nine yards. They're a fantastic nonprofit group of lawyers who do a lot of really fantastic work for folks. And they have a whole page set up right now around coronavirus specific issues. And if you need help legally, reach out to them, definitely. Because not everyone can afford a lawyer in these times.
yeah, absolutely.
So I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. So any like wrapping thoughts as we close?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are committed to fighting for these issues, and we're really excited to share some of them with you all today. But I think it's really important to underline that we can't do this alone, right? Like, you can't just elect an entrepreneurial person who's going to solve all these problems. What we need is also long-term organizing, both with groups like we mentioned earlier, and I'm hopeful that with a lot of the need happening right now in terms of connecting people to resources and volunteering and help, is that we can also build organizational capacity, because we need to have that to put pressure on our legislature to move quickly on these issues, right? And the fact that there's just such a kind of dragging of feet on so many issues, even before the COVID crisis, right? But I mean, I think it's just gotten even more, the consequences of dragging their feet has become more tangible and terrifying, right? Because it was one thing when there wasn't a pandemic. It's just utterly criminal during a pandemic. And again, I can't emphasize, I mean, I think in 8 or 10 days, we're going to be reaching the month mark of having a state of emergency. And what relief have we seen, right? And I've just heard from so many constituents, small businesses. I mean, we need to provide bold action from our government to help people get through this crisis. And so I think that's something that you and I are incredibly committed to shifting that culture of the state house. Our basic human rights, right? That is the role of government, particularly democratic government. And we need to see that change rather than this sort of like weeks and weeks of nothing. And in fact, just like I think this week they were debating whether the House and the Senate, no joke, are debating whether it's okay to turn off people's water utility.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's just like, are we really at that level?
That's
what we're discussing right now. And like, we need to be washing our hands. Like, on what condition does it ever make sense to turn off people's water?
Never. That's
never.
So
yeah. So anyway, so that's
we have Democratic supermajorities in the Senate and House.
The supermajority Democratic legislature is debating whether your water should be shut off or not. Like, this is insane.
That is probably the most clear call for change I've seen or heard. I saw one more question from offline. What city has the social housing model? Most countries have really great ones outside of the US. The one that I am a big fan of is Vienna in Austria. They have probably the best mixed income social housing policy I've seen. I'll drop a link if you all want to get nerdy and read about Vienna social housing. I highly recommend it. To learn more. I think that's a great model to move towards because it's probably the best out there I've seen.
Definitely.
So some other closing thoughts. I echo everything you just said. It's outrageous that it's taken the state legislature so long to do something as basic, 2.5 weeks to pass an eviction moratorium in the midst of the worst public health pandemic that we've seen. It's just now, yeah, now more than ever, it's time, I think, for renters, for young folks, for activists to get into the state house, to shake the table, and to really press for the change we need to build a Massachusetts for the many.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. And
Great.
how else can folks reach you on social media? My Twitter, I will put in the chat. Jordan is at Jordan for MA. And for Erica, what is your Twitter handle?
My Twitter handle is, well, so my Facebook, to start you off, is Elect Erica. And let me just confirm my Twitter handle, which is Erica number 4 rep. So Erica 4 rep. So you can find me there. And my campaign website is electerica.com. So you can find all those resources, as well as, information around more of my policy platform on my website. So.
And my Facebook, you're all on my Facebook right now. My website is jordanforma.com. You can find more info on my stuff, links to our Medium posts that we've done around policy stuff. And I guess stay tuned for more of these live streams. This has been fantastic, really illuminating, and just really great to chat with a fellow candidate who's going through this.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone for joining us during this live stream. This is so important to kind of maintain these connections when we are all so isolated right now. So thank you everyone for joining and for the engaging questions. And hopefully we'll see you all very soon.
Yeah, hopefully on doors very soon.
Yeah, in person preferably.
We're outside of my apartment.
Right, yeah. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you again, Erica, and for everyone tuning in. And
awesome.
Stay safe out there and wash your hands.
Take care. Thanks.
All right. See you, everyone.